What would you do if the world gave you only 3 choices, and none of them felt like freedom? On a quiet morning in Texas, one woman decides she will not be defined by loss, by society, or by fear. Her journey begins with a simple act, but it will challenge everything she thought she knew about strength, independence, and trust. Stay with this story. You might see yourself in it.
It was 5:47 in the morning. The sun hadn't shown its face yet. The Texas autumn air held a bite. Sharp. Cold enough to turn a breath into a cloud of white smoke. Frost clung to the dry prairie grass, waiting for the daylight to burn it away. Clara Pendleton stood on the front porch of the timber house she had called home for 19 years. 19 years of sweeping dust from the floorboards. 19 years of drawing water from the crank well on the side. 19 years of a life built piece by piece. In her right hand, she held a piece of heavy white paper. It had a red seal stamped at the bottom. The seal of the county bank. She had read the words on it so many times over the past hour that the letters had stopped making sense. They just blurred into shapes. Foreclosure. Final notice. She didn't cry. Tears didn't pay debts in 1878. Tears didn't fix fences. And they certainly didn't soften the hearts of bankers who wore wool suits and pocket watches. Clara just stood there. She let the cold wind wash over her face. She listened to the dry rustle of the dead grass. She realized in that moment how different silence sounds when you know nobody is ever coming home to break it. Henry had been dead for 14 months, a stray bullet from a cattle rustler down near the Pecos. That was all it took. 1 second he was a man, a husband, a partner. The next he was a memory and a mound of dirt out by the old oak tree. He left behind a good saddle hanging by the door, and a debt of $340. They had borrowed it to buy more grazing land right before the cattle fever of '76 wiped out 2/3 of their herd. Since the day they lowered Henry into the ground, Clara had worked. Lord, how she had worked. She sold eggs. She sold milk. She took in mending from the women in town until her fingers bled and her eyes ached by the light of the kerosene lamp. She had whittled that mountain of debt down, dollar by agonizing dollar. She owed $87. $87. To a man with a railroad empire, it was the price of a good evening in a parlor car. To Clara, it was the distance between having a roof and living on the charity of a town that pitied her. The bank gave her 30 days. If she didn't have the $87 by then, the timber house, the well, and the land would belong to the men in the wool suits. Clara folded the paper slowly, carefully, making the creases sharp. She slid it into the deep pocket of her faded blue cotton apron. She turned around, her boots making a dull thud on the porch, and walked back into the kitchen to put the kettle on. It was what she did every morning. She made coffee. So she would make coffee today, even if it was the beginning of the end. While she waited for the water to boil, she looked out the small, smudged window above the cast-iron stove. Out back, near the weathered split-rail fence, a horse was grazing. It was a chestnut gelding, tall, strong in the chest, It wasn't her horse. The chestnut had wandered onto her property 3 days ago. Just showed up, dragging a broken lead rope, looking thirsty and confused. Clara had watered him, fed him a bit of Henry's leftover oats. She checked his flank and found a brand, an oak leaf split down the middle, Broken Oak Ranch. She knew where it was, 11 miles northwest, right near the foothills. She knew she had to take the horse back, not today, maybe. Her boots were worn, her back ached from churning butter the day before, and the foreclosure notice was burning a hole in her apron pocket. But Clara was a woman of the West. You didn't keep a stray horse. You didn't take what wasn't yours, not even if the world was busy taking everything that was yours. She poured her coffee. Black, bitter. She drank it standing up. Clara Pendleton was 43 years old. If you looked at her, you saw a practical woman. Hair the color of dark earth, threaded with silver, pulled back tight at the nape of her neck. Hands that were rough, calloused, scarred from barbed wire and hot stoves. She wore no jewelry except a plain gold band. She knew how to gut a chicken. She knew how to read a storm coming by the yellow tint in the clouds. The folks in town called her capable. It was the word people used for a woman they expected to suffer without complaining. But underneath the faded blue dress, behind the quiet, practical eyes, Clara was exhausted. She was tired of being the capable widow. She was tired of the trap she was caught in. Because in 1878, a 43-year-old widow with no money had exactly 3 choices. 1. Sell the land for pennies, move into town, and become a seamstress or a maid, scrubbing floors for women who had less sense than her but living husbands. 2. Marry again, fast. Find a man with a steady income, even if he was cold, even if he was cruel. Give up Henry's memory for a meal ticket. Josiah Vance, a merchant in town with cold eyes and a fat wallet, had already tipped his hat and made his intentions clear twice. 3. Figure out how to save herself. She had tried the third. She was $87 short. She rinsed her cup, set it on the drying rack. She walked out the back door, grabbed the frayed lead rope, and clicked her tongue at the chestnut. "Come on, boy," she said. Her voice was raspy from the morning air. "Let's get you home." The walk took half the day. 11 miles is a long way when the sun finally breaks over the horizon and starts baking the dust. It's a long way when your left boot has a thin sole. She walked rhythmically, one foot in front of the other. The chestnut followed docilely behind, the leather of his halter creaking in the quiet morning. The prairie stretched out around her, a vast ocean of scrub brush, mesquite, and pale yellow grass. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. It didn't care about her $87. It didn't care about the paper in her pocket. The land just was. As she walked, her mind drifted. She tried not to let it, but walking 11 miles leaves a lot of room for ghosts. She thought about St. Louis, about the crisp white aprons and the smell of carbolic acid. Before Henry, before Texas, Clara had been a nursing student. She had trained under a program inspired by Elizabeth Blackwell. She knew anatomy. She knew how to stitch a wound so it wouldn't fester. She knew the difference between a milk fever and typhoid. She had a mind built for science, built for healing. But society didn't hand medical degrees to women in dresses. When Henry asked her to come west, she packed away her books. She chose him. She didn't regret Henry. She loved him fiercely, but she regretted the waste of her hands. For 19 years, the only things she healed were colicky calves and Henry's occasional axe nicks. And now the bank was going to take the land, and her medical knowledge wouldn't buy her a loaf of bread in town. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. Dust clung to her skin. By the time the wooden archway of the Broken Oak Ranch came into view, the sun was high and hot. Her legs burned. It wasn't a fancy place. No sweeping verandas or painted fences. It was a working ranch, practical, weather-beaten. The main house was solid oak, but the paint was peeling. There was no one on the porch to greet her, no ranch hands milling about. Just the sound of metal hitting metal. A sharp, rhythmic clanging coming from near the barn. Clara led the chestnut toward the sound. A heavy freight wagon was propped up on a thick wooden block. A man was lying in the dirt underneath it, hammering at an iron axle. He wore a faded flannel shirt, slick with grease and sweat. He didn't hear her approach over the sound of the hammer. "Excuse me," Clara called out. Her voice cracked a little from the dust. The hammering stopped. A pair of heavy leather boots shifted. The man slid out from under the wagon. He stood up, wiping his hands on a greasy rag he pulled from his back pocket. Silas Montgomery was 47 years old. He looked it, and he didn't. His hair was dark, peppered with gray at the temples. His face was carved by wind and sun, lined around the eyes. A long, jagged scar ran down his right forearm, disappearing into the rolled-up sleeve of his flannel shirt. It looked like an old knife wound, or maybe a bad tear from barbed wire. He looked at Clara. Then he looked at the horse. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a polite, empty greeting. He just studied her. He took in the dust on her dress, the exhaustion pulling at the corners of her mouth, the worn leather of her boots. "You found Chestnut," Silas said. His voice was deep, scraping like gravel. "He found me," Clara said. She held out the lead rope. "Showed up at my place 3 days ago, down near the South Ridge." Silas walked over. He took the rope. His fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second, rough, calloused. He patted the horse's neck. "I've been looking for him for 3 days," Silas said. 4, Clara corrected automatically. "I was too busy churning and mending to walk him back the first day." Silas looked back at her. His eyes were sharp. They weren't looking at her like a piece of property or a pitiful widow. They were looking at her like a person who had just done a hard, honest thing. "Where is your place?" he asked. "The Pendleton spread, 11 miles southeast." Silas absorbed that. He looked down at her boots again. He looked at the horse. Then he looked at the sky, gauging the time. "You walked 11 miles, he stated. It wasn't a question. "I don't have a riding horse right now," Clara said. Her chin tilted up just a fraction. A defensive posture. She didn't want him to know about the foreclosure. She didn't want his pity. "And I don't hold on to things that belong to other people." She took a step back. "Well, he's home. I need to be starting back." She turned to go. She was tired to her bones, and the thought of the 11 miles back made her stomach drop, but she would do it. She had to. "Mrs. Pendleton?" Clara stopped. She looked over her shoulder. Silas hadn't moved. He was still holding the rope, but his posture had shifted. The guarded, solitary rancher look had cracked just a little. "You walked 11 miles to return a horse to a stranger," Silas said. "Please stay for a cup of coffee. That's just Western fairness." Clara hesitated. The wind kicked up a swirl of dust around her ankles. Every instinct she had, every lesson drilled into her by the gossips in town, screamed at her to keep walking. She was a widow. He was a widower. In a place like Marfa, a woman alone on a man's porch was a scandal waiting to be minted. Beatrice Higgins would have a field day at the market if she found out. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Montgomery," Clara said, her tone polite but firm. "But people in town, they talk. I have enough trouble without giving them a reason to flap their jaws." Silas didn't back down. He didn't brush off her concern. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance just enough so she could hear him clearly over the wind. His expression was dead serious. "Society out there might label you a solitary widow and me a barren widower," Silas said, his voice ringing out clear and steady. "But on my porch, you are a human being who deserves respect for her integrity. Don't let prejudice strip you of your right to rest, Mrs. Pendleton." Clara froze. She stared at him. The words hung in the air between them. Nobody talked like that. Not to her. Men in Marfa talked about weather and beef prices and what a woman ought to be doing in the kitchen. They didn't talk about integrity. They didn't talk about prejudice. They certainly didn't validate a woman's right to simply rest. She looked at the house, at the wide wooden porch. It looked shaded. It looked quiet. Her feet ached with a dull, throbbing pain. The paper in her pocket felt heavy. She looked back at Silas Montgomery. He wasn't pressuring her. He was just holding the door open, offering a sliver of humanity in a world that had felt incredibly inhumane that morning. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her shoulders dropped just an inch. "Black," Clara said. Silas blinked. "Pardon?" "I take my coffee black, Mr. Montgomery, if you're brewing." A faint, almost imperceptible shift happened in Silas's face. Not quite a smile, but an easing of the lines around his eyes. He nodded once. "Black it is. Come on up to the porch." Clara turned around. She walked past the wagon. She walked up the 2 wooden steps. She stepped onto the porch, out of the blazing Texas sun, and into the shade. It was the smallest choice she had made all year, and it was the one that was about to change everything. The coffee was black. It tasted like roasted earth and stubbornness. Clara held the tin cup in both hands. The heat seeped through the metal. It warmed her palms. She sat on a wooden chair on the porch of the Broken Oak Ranch. Silas Montgomery sat on a bench opposite her. They didn't speak. Not at first. The Texas wind blew across the yard. It kicked up little dust devils. It rattled the dry leaves of the oak tree out front. Clara watched the wind. She watched the land. From the porch, she could see the eastern fields. The wheat was golden, heavy. The stalks were starting to bow under their own weight. It was late autumn. The frost was coming. Any fool could smell it in the morning air. If that wheat wasn't cut soon, it would rot. Clara shifted her gaze. She looked at the barn. The roof was missing 3 shingles on the north side. The corral fence leaned heavily to the left. A water trough sat half empty, the pump handle tied off with a piece of frayed rope. It was a good ranch, a strong ranch, but it was bleeding. It was a place crying out for hands. Silas sat perfectly still. He drank his coffee. He didn't stare at her. He didn't make her feel like a trespasser. He just looked out at the same golden wheat. Clara looked at his right hand. When he had poured the coffee in the kitchen, she had noticed it. His grip was tight, too tight. It was the grip of a man compensating for a weakness. The long, jagged scar on his forearm disappeared into his rolled-up sleeve. The fingers were stiff. They didn't bend naturally around the tin cup. He was running this place alone. Or mostly alone. Clara's mind started to work. It was a practical mind, a mind used to measuring ounces of flour and drops of medicine. Now it measured time and money. She owed the bank $87. A good ranch hand in Marfa got $1.50 a day. $2 if they were fast and didn't drink the profits. If she worked 40 days, that was $80. Add in a share of the harvest, some winter cabbage, maybe a sack of milled flour. $87. It was a terrifying thought. A widow hiring herself out as a field hand. The town would talk until their throats went dry. Beatrice Higgins would probably faint on the steps of the Mercantile. Clara took another sip of the bitter coffee. She thought about the foreclosure notice burning a hole in her apron pocket. Let them talk. Gossip couldn't put a roof over her head. She set her tin cup down on the wooden crate between them. The metal clinked against the wood. The sound cut through the wind. Silas looked over. "Your wheat is turning," Clara said. Her voice was flat, rhythmic. 2 weeks, 3 at the most. Then the frost gets it. Silas didn't flinch. "I know. You don't have a crew." "I had 2 men," Silas said. He kept his eyes on the field. One broke his ankle in a prairie dog hole. The other packed up and went to San Antonio. Said the work was too hard. "It is hard," Clara said. "But it has to be done." Silas finally looked at her. Really looked at her. His eyes were the color of slate, hard, weathered. "It'll get done. I have a Mexican boy coming up from Presidio next week, and I have 2 good hands." He lifted his left arm, then gestured slightly with his stiff right arm. "You have 1.5, Clara said. It wasn't an insult. It was a medical fact. She stated it like a doctor diagnosing a fever. Silas's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. Then it relaxed. He didn't get angry. He recognized the truth when he heard it. "Maybe," he said quietly. Clara leaned forward. She folded her hands in her lap. Her back was straight. "I need $87, Clara said. Exactly $87. And I need it in 30 days. Silas set his cup down. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what she owed or who she owed it to. That was her business. "I can give you 40 days of labor," Clara continued. Her voice didn't shake. "I can cut wheat. I can haul water. I can cook the noon meal so your hands don't have to stop working. I know how to mend harness. I know how to pack a root cellar." Silas stared at her. The silence stretched out. The wind howled around the corners of the porch. "You're a woman alone, Mrs. Pendleton," Silas said slowly. You live 11 miles away, if you need a loan. I didn't ask for a loan. The words snapped like a dry twig. Clara's eyes flashed. I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Montgomery, Clara said. Her voice rose, carrying clearly over the rustling oak leaves. I know what society expects. They expect a widow to beg. They expect me to go to the town council to weep, to ask for grace or pity. But pity doesn't pay bank loans, and pity strips a person of their soul. Silas didn't interrupt. He listened, truly listened. True equality, Clara said, her words measured and absolute, begins with my right to work. It begins with my right to be compensated fairly for my sweat, just like any man. I don't need anyone to save me, Silas. I need a fair chance. I need to earn my survival with my own two hands. Because if I don't, then I don't really own my life at all. She stopped. Her chest heaved slightly. She hadn't spoken that many words at once in 14 months. Silas Montgomery sat back. He looked at the woman sitting on his porch. He saw the fire in her, the desperate, fierce pride. He saw a person refusing to be crushed by a world that was entirely designed to crush her. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't offer to lower the work expectations. $2 a day, Silas said. Clara blinked. $2 a day, Silas repeated. For 40 days. That's $80. I'll make up the remaining 7 in winter vegetables and milled flour. You take it back with you on the weekends. Clara calculated it. It was exactly what she needed. I won't sleep here, Clara stated. I will ride over at dawn. I will leave before the sun sets. I have my own home to keep. Agreed, Silas said. And we don't call it helping out. This isn't a favor. This is a labor contract. You are paying for my time. I am giving you my labor. It's a contract, Silas confirmed. His slate eyes held a glint of deep respect. I wouldn't insult you by calling it anything else. Clara let out a slow breath, the knot in her chest, the knot that had been tight since the banker handed her the paper, loosened just a fraction. Then we have a deal, she said. One condition, Silas said. Clara stiffened. Here it was, the catch, the trap. She waited. Silas reached out. He tapped the wooden crate between them. Morning coffee, he said. Every day. Before the work starts. Right here on this porch. Clara looked at him. She looked for the hidden motive, the inappropriate angle. She found none. She saw a man who had been drinking coffee alone for a very long time. That's not a labor condition, Clara said softly. No, Silas agreed. It's courtesy. It's the only thing I ask that isn't in the contract. Clara looked at her empty tin cup. Then she looked at Silas. I'll be here Monday morning, at dawn, she said. Have the coffee ready, and make it black. Silas nodded. I will. Clara stood up. She didn't shake his hand. It wasn't the time for that. She walked down the porch steps. She untied the chestnut horse from the post. She swung herself up into the saddle. It was a man's saddle, wide and uncomfortable. She didn't care. She turned the horse toward the east, toward home. She had 11 miles to ride. She had $87 to earn. And for the first time in over a year, she felt like she might just survive. The scythe was heavy. The handle was made of polished hickory. The curved steel blade was sharp enough to slice through a leather boot. Clara held it with both hands. She stood at the edge of the eastern field. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, Tuesday of the second week. The morning coffee was already a memory, a warm, bitter ghost lingering on her tongue. They had sat on the porch, in silence, watching the sun break over the horizon. Silas had poured. Clara had drank. No words were needed. Now the work began. Clara swung the scythe. It bit into the base of the golden wheat stalks. Swish, crack, the stalks fell, neatly, cleanly. Stalks. She stepped forward, swung again. Swish, crack. It was a rhythm, like a heartbeat, like breathing. You couldn't fight the rhythm, or the scythe would bite into the dirt and dull the blade. You had to flow with it. Her shoulders ached, a deep, burning ache that settled into the muscle and refused to leave. The Texas sun was climbing higher. It beat down on her back. Sweat trickled down her neck, dampening the collar of her faded blue dress. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat to keep the sun off her face. But the heat was everywhere. 10 yards to her right, Silas was working. He didn't use a scythe. His right hand couldn't grip the long handle tight enough to control the heavy swing. Instead, he used a hand sickle. He bent low, grabbing a handful of wheat with his left hand, slicing it clean with the sickle in his right. It was slower work, punishing work for a tall man. Clara watched him out of the corner of her eye. She watched the way his jaw clenched when he had to pull hard with his scarred arm. She saw the tremor in his fingers when he paused to wipe his brow. She didn't offer to help him. She knew better. A man's pride was a fragile thing. A man doing hard labor with a broken body didn't want a woman's sympathy. He wanted to be left alone to do the work. So she matched his pace. She didn't swing faster to show him up. She didn't swing slower to make him feel better. She just worked. A few yards behind them were the other hands. There was Mateo, the boy from Presidio, 18 years old, quiet, hard-working. He gathered the fallen wheat and tied it into neat sheaves. He never complained. He just nodded when Clara handed him a water canteen. Then there was Miller. Miller was a drifter, 30-something, broad-shouldered, fast with a scythe. He had been hired 3 days ago when Silas realized the frost was coming faster than predicted. Miller cut more wheat in an hour than Mateo could tie in 2. But Miller had a mouth on him. He swaggered. He looked at Clara not as a fellow worker, but as an anomaly, a piece of entertainment in an otherwise dull field. "You swing pretty good for a woman wearing skirts, Mrs. Pendleton," Miller called out over the sound of the wind. Clara didn't stop swinging. Swish, crack. "I swing to cut wheat, Mr. Miller," Clara said. "Keep your eyes on your own blade." Miller chuckled, a greasy, sliding sound. "Just making conversation. A widow woman ought to be glad for a man's attention out in this heat. Gets lonely, I imagine." Clara stopped. She lowered the scythe. She turned around. The sun was directly in her eyes, so she tilted the brim of her hat down. She looked at Miller. He was leaning on his scythe handle, wiping sweat from his chest. He was smiling. An ugly smile. "I am paid to harvest," Clara said. Her voice was ice. "You are paid to harvest. If you have breath to waste on foolishness, you aren't working hard enough." She turned back around. She lifted her scythe. She started swinging again. Mateo kept his head down. Silas had been at the far end of the row. He hadn't heard. By noon, the heat was a physical weight. The air was thick with dust and wheat chaff. It stuck to their sweat. It coated their throats. Clara laid down her scythe. It was time to make the noon meal. Beans, cornbread, and salted pork. It wasn't fancy, but it kept men standing. She walked toward this water barrel, sitting under the shade of a lone mesquite tree near the barn. Her legs felt like lead. She grabbed the tin dipper hanging on a nail. She pushed the wooden lid aside and dipped it into the cool water. She drank. It tasted like heaven. "Save some for the rest of us, widow." Clara stiffened. Miller had walked up behind her. She hadn't heard his boots in the dust. She lowered the dipper. She didn't turn around. She hung the dipper back on the nail. She stepped to the side to let him pass. Miller didn't go for the water. He stepped into her path. He stood too close. The smell of sour sweat and old tobacco rolled off him. "You know," Miller said, dropping his voice, "a woman working a man's job. It ain't natural. Makes a man wonder what else she's willing to do for $1. He reached out. His thick, dirt-caked fingers wrapped around Clara's upper arm. Not a gentle touch. A hard, possessive grip. Clara didn't scream. Years of nursing, years of dealing with pain and panic took over. Her mind went cold. She looked at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up into his face. "Remove your hand," Clara said. The words were quiet, lethal. "Aw, don't be like that," Miller grinned. "I'm just being friendly." Let go of her arm. The voice didn't belong to Clara. It came from behind Miller, deep, scraping like gravel, heavy with a quiet, terrible violence. Miller dropped his hand. He spun around. Silas stood 10 feet away. He held his hand sickle. The curved steel blade caught the midday sun. His face was blank, completely devoid of emotion, and that made it terrifying. "Mr. Montgomery," Miller stammered, his swagger vanishing. Just getting a drink. Having a word with the lady." Silas didn't look at Clara. He kept his slate eyes locked on Miller. "Go to the bunkhouse," Silas said. The words were clipped, rhythmic. "Roll your bedroll, gather your gear. Come to the front porch in 5 minutes. I will pay you for your 3 days. Then you will walk off my land." Miller stared at him. The color drained from his face. You're firing me? Over a joke?" 5 minutes, Silas said. "You can't afford to fire me." Miller raised his voice, pointing toward the golden fields. "The frost is coming. I cut twice the wheat that Mexican kid does. You fire me, half your crop rots in the field." Silas stepped forward, just 1 step, but Miller stepped back. 5 minutes, Silas repeated softly. "Or I drag you off the property by your boots." Miller swallowed hard. He looked at the sickle in Silas's hand. He looked at the hard, unyielding lines of Silas's face. He turned and practically ran toward the bunkhouse. Silence fell over the water barrel. The only sound was the cicadas buzzing in the mesquite tree. Silas slowly lowered the sickle. He didn't turn to look at Clara. He just stood there, staring at the dust. Clara took a breath. Her arm throbbed where Miller had grabbed her. She stepped forward. "He was right," Clara said. Her voice was steady, practical. "He was your fastest cutter. We need the speed. I could have handled him. A harsh word from you would have kept him in line." Silas finally turned to look at her. His eyes were blazing, not with anger at her, but with a deep, furious conviction. "No harvesting skill can make up for a lack of basic human respect," Silas said. The words rang out, clear and absolute in the heavy air. He walked closer to her. He didn't touch her. He stood at a respectful distance. "Listen to me, Clara," Silas said, stating the truth like it was a law of nature. "Man or woman, hired hand or owner, respecting another's body and dignity is the highest law on this land. I don't care if he cuts 10 times the wheat. I don't care if the frost takes every last stalk and I have to sell my boots to buy winter flour." He pointed a finger toward the bunkhouse. "I'd rather lose the entire crop than tolerate someone who tramples on the dignity of another human being. You are here to work. You are not here to be harassed, belittled, or touched against your will. Not on my property. Not ever." Clara looked into his face. She had lived in a world that told her a woman's safety was dependent on a man's mood. She had been taught that enduring disrespect was just part of a woman's lot. And here stood a man, willing to let his livelihood rot in the dirt, simply because a hired hand had laid an unwanted hand on her arm. She didn't thank him. Thank you was too small a word. "The crop won't rot," Clara said simply. Silas looked at her. "I'll swing faster," Clara said. "Mateo can tie faster. We'll start an hour earlier. We'll work an hour later. We will bring the harvest in." Silas held her gaze for a long moment. The anger in his eyes slowly faded. It was replaced by something else, a profound, quiet recognition. He saw the strength in her, and she saw the honor in him. "I know we will," Silas said. He turned toward the house to get his lockbox. He had a man to pay off. Clara turned back to the water barrel. She filled the wooden bucket to carry to the kitchen. The water was heavy. The day was only half over. Her arm still ached. But as she walked back toward the house to build the fire for the noon meal, Clara Pendleton felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt safe, Not because a man was protecting her, but because she was standing on ground where her humanity was worth more than the harvest. The town of Marfa was loud, too loud. After 6 days of nothing but the wind and the rhythmic sweep of the scythe, the noise of Main Street felt like a physical weight. It was Saturday morning. Clara Pendleton walked down the boardwalk. The wood groaned under her boots. Dust kicked up from the wagon wheels in the street, coating the hems of the women's dresses. Men tipped their hats as she passed, but their eyes lingered a second too long. A week ago, Clara was just the grieving widow on the edge of town, invisible, pitied, safe. Today she was a story. She could feel it in the air. She felt it in the way the conversation dipped at the blacksmith shop when she walked by. She felt it in the tight smiles of the women carrying their market baskets. Gossip in a Texas ranch town didn't travel like a train. It moved like a grass fire, quiet, close to the ground, burning everything in its path. Clara pushed open the heavy glass door of the mercantile. The bell jingled. The smell of roasted coffee beans, oiled leather, and peppermint candy hit her. It was a good smell, but today the air inside felt thick. She walked to the counter. She laid down $2 silver, Silas Montgomery's money, earned with a blistered right hand and an aching back. 10 pounds of flour, Mr. Higgins, Clara said, and a tin of baking soda. Arthur Higgins, a man with thinning hair and spectacles perched on his nose, hesitated. He looked at the silver. Then he looked at the back room. "Right away, Mrs. Pendleton," he mumbled, wiping his hands on his apron. He hurried off. Before Clara could take a breath, the floorboards creaked behind her. "Clara, dear." Clara stiffened. She didn't need to turn around to know the voice. It was Beatrice Higgins, Arthur's wife, the unofficial mayor of the Marfa Sewing Circle. Beatrice wore a high-collared silk dress that cost more than Clara's horse. Clara turned. She kept her face blank. "Good morning, Beatrice." Beatrice stepped close, too close. She reached out and patted Clara's arm. Her fingers were cold. "I was just telling Arthur I haven't seen you all week, and then, well, then I heard." "Heard what?" Clara asked, flat, rhythmic. Beatrice leaned in. She lowered her voice to a theatrical whisper. "About you, out at the Broken Oak, with that Montgomery man." Clara didn't blink. "I am working the harvest, Beatrice. He needs hands. I need the wages." Beatrice gasped softly. She pressed a hand to her collarbone. "Oh, Clara, working the fields like a common laborer, and alone out there with a widower? The whole town is talking. They're saying, well, I won't repeat the ugliness, but you must think of your reputation." Clara looked at Beatrice. She looked at the silk dress. She thought about the foreclosure notice, still folded in her apron back home. "My reputation?" Clara asked. "Yes, dear. A woman's honor is all she has," Beatrice said, her eyes wide with manufactured concern. "Josiah Vance was just in here yesterday. He was heartbroken. He said it was a tragedy to see a respectable woman lower herself so. He said he would have gladly taken care of you if you had just been reasonable." Josiah Vance. So, that was the source of the fire. Vance had lit the match. A man whose marriage proposal she had declined. A man who couldn't stand the thought of a woman surviving without his permission. Clara stood up straighter. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Beatrice, listen to me very carefully," Clara said. The words cut through the smell of coffee and leather like a sharp blade. Beatrice stopped patting her arm. She took a half step back. "If a woman's honor is so fragile that it can be destroyed simply because she's doing honest labor to support herself, then that honor is a prison, Beatrice. It is a cage." Clara pointed to the silver dollars on the counter. "I earned that money. My hands are blistered. My back aches. But my conscience is entirely clear. True respectability does not come from sitting quietly and starving in the dark just to keep the town gossips comfortable. It comes from the courage to survive." Beatrice's mouth fell open. She stammered, "I only meant..." I choose the freedom of one who stands on her own 2 feet, Clara stated firmly. The educational weight of her words landed heavy in the quiet store. You go tell Josiah Vance. You tell the sewing circle. I am a working woman, and there is no shame in a calloused hand. The only shame is in a society that demands a woman be helpless to be considered good. Arthur Higgins returned with a sack of flour. He set it on the counter with a heavy thud. He looked terrified. Clara picked up the flour. She tucked the baking soda into her pocket. Good day, Beatrice, Clara said. She walked out of the store. The bell jingled behind her. She stepped out into the blinding Texas sun. Her head held high. Hurrah! While Clara was fighting a war of words in town, a different kind of war was arriving at the Broken Oak. It was Monday morning. The air was already hot. Silas was by the corral, checking the hooves of a roan gelding. The harvest was paused for an hour to tend the livestock. Clara was in the kitchen baking the week's bread. A black buggy rolled up the long dirt drive. It was a shiny rig, red spokes, polished leather seats. It didn't belong on a working ranch. It belonged on the paved streets of a city. The buggy stopped near the porch. Josiah Vance stepped out. Vance was 52. He wore a gray 3-piece suit. A gold watch chain hung across his vest. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick. He didn't use it for walking. He used it for pointing. Silas dropped the roan's hoof. He stood up. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He didn't walk toward Vance. He let Vance come to him. "Morning, Montgomery," Vance said. He tipped his bowler hat. He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "Vance," Silas said. One word, rhythmic, cold. "Hot day for a harvest," Vance said, looking out at the fields. He tapped his stick against his polished boot. "Here you're short on hands. The frost is coming. I've got a crew finishing up down south. I could send them up. For a percentage of the crop, of course. Say 40%. It was highway robbery. Vance knew it. Silas knew it. "My crop is coming in fine," Silas said. "I don't need your crew." Vance chuckled. It sounded like dry leaves scraping on stone. "Come now, Silas. Pride is a poor man's blanket. It doesn't keep you warm at night. Besides, I hear your current workforce is a bit unconventional." Silas didn't blink. His slate eyes locked onto Vance. He didn't speak. He waited. Vance stepped closer. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of male camaraderie that made Silas's stomach turn. "I'm talking about the widow Pendleton. It's the talk of the county, Silas. A woman like that, desperate for cash. Out here, miles from anyone. People are starting to wonder what exactly you're paying her for." The silence that followed was absolute. A horse snorted in the corral. A hawk circled high overhead. Silas Montgomery stood perfectly still. The scar on his right arm seemed to pull tight. "Josiah," Silas said softly. The softness was dangerous. "I'm just giving you friendly advice," Vance held up his hands in a placating gesture. "It looks bad, for both of you. Send her packing. I'll send my crew. It's the right thing to do, for her sake, really." Silas closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't draw a gun. He didn't raise his fist. He simply stood over Vance. Silas was 3 inches taller and built from 40 years of swinging axes and wrestling steers. "You don't know the first thing about what's right," Silas said. His voice didn't rise. It carried the heavy, unmovable weight of an iron anvil. "You listen to me, Vance," Silas stated, locking eyes with the merchant. "And you hear this clearly. The worth of a human being isn't determined by the money in your bank, and it isn't dictated by the malicious whispers of men who have nothing better to do. Mrs. Pendleton is doing honest, grueling labor on this land. Labor you wouldn't last 10 minutes doing." Vance's smug smile faltered. He took a half-step back, his polished boot catching on a clod of dirt. "I am stating this for the record," Silas continued, his words slicing through the dusty air. "Every individual has the fundamental right to work, to provide for themselves, and to live free from intimidation. Your attempt to leverage her gender and her poverty to steal my crop and ruin her name is the act of a coward." Vance's face flushed red. Anger replaced the false charm. "You're making a mistake, Montgomery. A big one. The bank isn't going to look kindly on a man who alienates the town's primary investors." "Get off my land," Silas said. "You're a fool," Vance spat. "I said get off my land, now." Silas didn't move. He stood like a monument. Vance looked at the scarred rancher, realized he had pushed as far as he safely could, and spun around. He climbed back into his shiny buggy. He cracked the whip. The horse lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over the dry grass. Silas watched the buggy disappear down the road. He heard the creak of the screen door. He turned around. Clara was standing on the porch. She had flour on her apron. Her hands were covered in dough. She had heard everything. Silas looked at her. He didn't apologize for Vance. He didn't try to soften the blow of what the town was saying. He treated her like an equal who could handle the truth. "He's trying to break you," Silas said, walking toward the porch. "He thinks if he ruins your name, you'll run back to him for cover." Clara wiped her dough-covered hands on a towel. Her jaw was set hard. "He thinks I'm a frightened bird," Clara said. She looked out at the road where the dust was still settling. "He's about to find out I'm a hawk." Silas stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at her. The sun caught the silver threads in her hair. "I have no doubt about that, Mrs. Pendleton," Silas said. "Coffee?" "Black," Clara replied. They didn't talk about Vance the rest of the day. They went back to the fields. They swung the scythe. They tied the wheat. They fought the shadows cast by small men by standing in the blazing sun and doing the work. The accident happened on a Thursday. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of heat that presses against your lungs and makes every breath a chore. The harvest was nearly finished. Only a few acres left. They were pushing hard. Too hard. Exhaustion makes men clumsy. Mateo was working near the wagon. He was using a sharpened machete to clear a patch of thick, thorny mesquite brush that had overgrown near the fence line, making room for the wagon to turn. He was swinging hard, tired, sweaty. Clara was 50 yards away, gathering sheaves. Silas was in the barn, fixing a broken harness strap. Clara heard the sound first. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was a sharp, wet thwack, followed by a terrifying, hollow silence. Then, a gasp that rattled in the chest. Clara dropped her bundle. She turned. Mateo was on his knees. The machete was in the dirt. He was clutching his left thigh. Between his dusty fingers, blood was pulsing, not seeping, pulsing, bright, arterial red. He had missed the brush. The blade had glanced off a thick root and buried itself in his leg. "Silas!" Clara screamed. She didn't freeze. She didn't faint. The widow Pendleton vanished in a split second, replaced by someone else entirely. Clara ran. She hiked her heavy cotton skirts and sprinted across the rough ground. By the time she reached Mateo, his face was the color of old ash. His eyes were wide, panicked, rolling back in his head. The blood was pooling in the dust, turning the earth into dark, sticky mud. "Mateo, look at me," Clara commanded. Her voice was sharp, authoritative, not a request, a bark. Mateo looked at her. Clara dropped to her knees in the blood and dirt. "Move your hands." It won't stop," the boy whispered. "Move them." Mateo let go. The blood spurted with the rhythm of his racing heart. The femoral artery wasn't severed, but a major branch was deeply nicked. He would bleed to death in 4 minutes. Silas arrived, running hard from the barn. He saw the blood. He froze for half a second, his face pale. "Silas!" Clara didn't look up. She was already tearing the hem of her apron into a long strip. "I need whiskey, high proof, now, and clean boiling water from the kitchen. Run." Silas didn't question her. He didn't say, "But you're a woman." He spun on his heel and sprinted toward the house faster than Clara had ever seen a man move. Clara folded the heavy cotton fabric into a thick square pad. "This is going to hurt, Mateo," Clara said calmly. "Scream if you need to." She shoved the pad directly into the gaping wound. Mateo screamed, a high, reedy sound that tore at the hot air. He bucked, trying to pull away. "Hold still," Clara ordered. She leaned all her body weight onto her hands, pressing down into the boy's thigh. She was applying direct pressure, not a tourniquet that would kill the leg. Precise, localized pressure to clamp the torn vessel. "Breathe, Mateo. Focus on my voice. Breathe in. Out." She counted with him, rhythmic, steady. Silas returned. He dropped to his knees beside her. He had a bottle of rye whiskey and a clean flour sack. "Pour the whiskey over my hands and the wound," Clara ordered. "Don't stop pouring until I say." Silas uncorked the bottle with his teeth. He poured. The harsh liquor washed over Clara's blood-soaked fingers and into Mateo's leg. Mateo bit his lip until it bled, thrashing. Silas used his heavy left arm to hold the boy's shoulders down. "Good. Now give me the flour sack." With terrifying precision, Clara maintained pressure with her left hand, while using her right hand and her teeth to twist the flour sack into a thick band. "Lift his leg, Silas. Just an inch." Silas lifted. Clara slid the band under the thigh. She tied it directly over the thick pad she was holding. She tied a specialized knot, a pressure dressing knot she had learned a lifetime ago. It held the pad ruthlessly tight against the wound without crushing the entire circulation of the leg. She sat back on her heels. She watched the dressing. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The white cloth turned pink, then red. But it didn't drip. The pulsing had stopped. The bleeding was controlled. Clara let out a long, shaky breath. She wiped a stray strand of hair from her face, leaving a smear of Mateo's blood on her forehead. "He needs a doctor to stitch the vessel properly," Clara said to Silas. Her voice was steady, but her hands had begun to shake slightly. "But he will live to make the trip. Load him into the wagon. Keep his leg elevated." Silas looked at the intricate, perfectly tied bandage. Then he looked at Clara. He saw the blood on her hands, her face, her dress. He saw the iron command in her eyes. He didn't ask questions. He picked Mateo up in his arms. It was evening. Mateo was at the doctor's office in town. Silas had driven him there and come back. The doctor had taken one look at the pressure dressing and asked Silas which army surgeon had tied it. Silas was sitting on the porch. The sun was going down, painting the Texas sky in violent shades of purple and gold. The screen door opened. Clara stepped out. She had washed. Her hands were scrubbed red. She wore her spare dress, a faded gray cotton. Her hair was damp around the edges. She carried 2 tin cups of black coffee. She handed one to Silas. She sat on the chair opposite him. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the crickets wake up. "The doctor in town said you saved his life," Silas said quietly. He kept his eyes on his coffee cup. "Said if you had just tied a rope around his leg like a regular cowhand would have, he'd have lost the limb. Said whoever tied that dressing knew human anatomy." Clara took a sip of her coffee. It was hot. It grounded her. "I do," Clara said. Silas looked up at her. He waited. He didn't pry. He just left space for the truth. Clara looked out at the darkening fields. The ghosts of her past were suddenly very close. "Before I came to Texas, before Henry," Clara began, her voice soft, rhythmic. "I lived in St. Louis. I spent 2 years studying in a medical ward. It was a program modeled after Elizabeth Blackwell's teachings. I learned anatomy. I learned pharmacology. I learned how to close a wound so the flesh wouldn't rot." Silas listened. He didn't interrupt. "I was at the top of my class," Clara said. There was no brag in her voice, just cold, buried grief. "I could diagnose typhoid before the fever broke. I had the hands of a surgeon." "Why did you stop?" Silas asked. Clara turned her head. She looked Silas directly in the eyes. "Because I wore a skirt," Clara said. Her voice tightened. The educational weight of her experience poured out into the evening air. The hospital board decided that women were too emotionally fragile to handle the rigors of professional medicine. They shut the program down. When Henry asked me to marry him, society told me I had to choose. Be a wife or be an outcast fighting a wall of men in suits. This world stripped me of my credentials simply because of my gender. They believe intellect and capability are classified by what a person wears, rather than what is in their mind. She looked down at her hands, rough, scarred hands. For 19 years, I let them tell me they were right. I let my hands churn butter and mend shirts while people miles away died of fevers I knew how to break. Silas set his coffee cup down on the wooden crate. The sound was sharp in the quiet evening. He didn't offer pity. He didn't tell her it was a shame. Silas reached down to his right arm. He unbuttoned the cuff of his flannel shirt. Slowly, deliberately, he rolled the sleeve up past his elbow. He held his arm out toward her. The scar was terrible. Thick, ropey, and jagged. It cut deep across the flexor muscles of his forearm. His fingers curled inward, stiff and unyielding. "A barbed wire tear," Silas said, his voice grating in the twilight. 9 years ago, the local sawbones just sewed the skin shut, left the tendons torn, left the muscle to wither. Clara looked at the arm. The nurse in her leaned forward instinctively. Her eyes scanned the damage, assessing the scar tissue, the atrophy. Silas looked into Clara's eyes. "That world that told you to stop. They were dead wrong," Silas stated. His voice vibrated with absolute conviction. The words weren't just a comfort. They were a declaration of a universal truth. "The right to heal," Silas said clearly, "and the right to contribute one's abilities belongs to all of humanity. It isn't a privilege granted by men in boardrooms. It is a divine right. I don't care what papers you don't have. I don't care what the town thinks." He pushed his crippled arm an inch closer to her. "I am trusting you with this arm," Silas said. "Not because you are a woman, not because I pity you, but because you are the finest healer I have ever seen, and I am asking for your help." Clara stared at his arm. Then she looked at his face. She saw the vulnerability he was offering. A man of the West exposing his weakness, asking for a woman to fix what another man had broken. Clara reached out. Her fingers, still slightly red from scrubbing away Mateo's blood, gently touched the thick scar tissue on Silas's arm. Silas didn't flinch. She pressed gently, feeling the tightness of the bound muscle. "The tendons are retracted," Clara murmured, her voice slipping naturally into a professional, confident cadence. "It has been 9 years. It will never be perfect, but there is deep tissue manipulation, stretching exercises. We can break up the adhesions. We can give you back some of your grip." "Whatever it takes," Silas said. Clara looked up from his arm. Her eyes were bright, alive in a way they hadn't been in over a decade. "We start tomorrow," Clara said, "after the morning coffee." "Agreed," Silas said. They sat on the porch as the stars came out over Texas. The darkness was vast and cold, but for the first time, Clara didn't feel small underneath it. She felt like a woman who had finally remembered who she was. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to support more meaningful stories like this. The sky didn't just turn gray, it turned black. It happened on a Tuesday, late in the afternoon. The wind shifted. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of a single breath. The air smelled like ozone and wet dust. Then the sky broke open. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a Texas downpour. A violent, drumming wall of water that turned the dry earth into slick, treacherous mud within minutes. The washboard road that led 11 miles back to Clara's farm was already flooding. The low water crossing by the creek would be waist-deep and rushing fast enough to sweep a horse off its feet. Going home was out of the question. Clara stood on the porch watching the sheet of rain. She wiped her hands on her apron. She had been working at Broken Oak for nearly a month. 30 days of calluses, sweat, and the quiet rhythm of the scythe. She was exhausted. But it was a good exhaustion. The screen door creaked. Silas stepped out. He didn't look at the road, he looked at the sky. He held 2 tin cups. Steam rose from the dark liquid, fighting the cold, wet air. He handed her a cup. "The creek will be over its banks," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble, competing with the rain hitting the tin roof. "I know," Clara said. She took the cup. The heat burned her palms in a pleasant way. "There's a bed in the back room," Silas told her. "It belonged to my daughter, Abigail. She's in San Antonio now. The sheets are clean. It's yours for the night." He didn't make a fuss about it. He didn't act like it was a scandal. It was just a fact. A person couldn't ride in a flood. So she would stay. "Thank you, Silas," she said. Evening fell hard and fast. Without the sun, the ranch house felt smaller, tighter, but not suffocating. Silas lit a kerosene lamp in the kitchen. It cast a warm yellow circle on the scarred oak table. Clara cooked a simple supper: potatoes and salted beef. They ate in silence, listening to the storm rattle the window panes. After they ate, Silas brought out the coffee pot again. He set it on the stove to keep warm. He walked over to a small wooden shelf by the door and pulled down a stack of old newspapers. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, months old, mailed to him by a cousin. He set the stack on the table. "You read?" Silas asked. "I used to," Clara said. "Before." "Take your pick," he said, pushing the papers toward her. He sat down opposite her, pulling a piece of leather harness onto his lap. He started working a needle through it with his stiff right hand, using his left to pull the heavy wax thread. Clara picked up a paper. The date said April 1878. The news was old, but the ink was a comfort. She turned the pages. Past the grain prices. Past the political arguments in Washington. She stopped at the back page, the arts and letters section. There was a poem, Walt Whitman. Clara stared at the block of text. Her eyes scanned the lines. It wasn't about politics or money. It was about the human soul, about the open road and the heavy burdens people carry in secret. She didn't realize she was humming softly in agreement until she heard her own voice. Silas looked up. The needle stopped halfway through the leather. "Find something good?" he asked. Clara looked at him over the edge of the paper. The yellow lamplight caught the silver in her hair. "It's poetry," she said. "Walt Whitman." "Read it," Silas said. "It's long." "The rain isn't stopping any time soon. Read it." Clara took a breath. She smoothed the paper flat on the table. She hadn't read aloud to anyone since Henry died. Her voice started off thin, brittle. But as she read the words, the rhythm caught her. Her voice deepened. It smoothed out. She read about the earth, about the silent connection between strangers, about the dignity of simply walking forward. When she finished the final stanza, she let the paper rest on the table. The only sound was the rain. Silas was looking at her. He wasn't looking at a hired hand. He wasn't looking at a widow. He was looking at Clara. A woman with a mind, an education, and a voice that could make a cold kitchen feel like a cathedral. He set the leather harness down. "My wife, Martha, died of the lung fever," Silas said. His voice was quiet. The words felt heavy. 6 years ago. Clara didn't offer a polite sympathy. She just listened. "When we put her in the ground, the preacher told me to be strong," Silas continued. He looked at his scarred hands. "The men in town clapped my shoulder. They told me I had to be a rock, for the ranch, for my daughter. They told me that a man doesn't break, and he certainly doesn't cry." He looked up at Clara. His slate-gray eyes were shining in the lamplight. "We men are brainwashed by society," Silas stated, the words carrying a profound, hard-earned weight. "They teach us to believe that shedding a tear is cowardly, that we must be as solid and unfeeling as a stone wall. It is the cruelest lie ever told, Clara." Clara folded her hands on the table. "A stone wall doesn't feel the rain, but it doesn't feel the sun either." "Exactly," Silas nodded. The educational truth of his realization rang clear in the quiet room. The right to be vulnerable, the right to share your grief and admit that you are broken. That is the true strength of a human being. Stifling that pain doesn't make a man strong. It makes him dead inside. It makes him cruel. He reached out. His fingers hovered over the newspaper, tapping the edge of the poem she had just read. "I spent 6 years being a rock," Silas said softly. "You came here. You asked for nothing but a fair wage. You tied up a bleeding boy's leg. You read poetry in a rainstorm. You taught me how to take off that armor, Clara, and I'm entirely grateful." Clara's breath hitched. Nobody touched. They sat across the table from each other, but the distance between them vanished. "I built a wall too, Silas," Clara whispered. "I thought if I didn't need anybody, nobody could hurt me again. I thought pride was the same thing as safety." "Is it?" Silas asked. Clara looked into his eyes. "No, it's just a different kind of lonely." They sat together as the kerosene burned low. The storm raged outside, battering the wooden walls of the broken oak. But inside it was warm. The walls they had spent years building were starting to come down, brick by heavy brick. For the first time since Henry died, Clara didn't feel like she was just surviving. She felt alive. The rain passed by dawn. It left behind a washed-clean world. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The mud was thick, but the sun was already baking it back into hard dirt. It was Friday, payday. Clara had been working for nearly 5 weeks. She had saved almost everything. $68 sat in an old tin box hidden under a floorboard at her house. She needed 87. With today's wages and next week's final push, she would make it. She would take the money to the bank, throw it on the polished mahogany desk, and walk out a free woman. She was in the barn, currying the chestnut horse, when she heard the rider approach. Clara stepped to the barn doors. A boy from town riding a piebald pony pulled up by the porch. He was holding a yellow envelope. Silas was already walking out of the house to meet him. Silas took the envelope. He handed the boy a nickel. The boy turned his pony and rode off. Silas stood on the porch looking at the envelope. He didn't open it. He just stared at the writing on the front. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked like carved granite. Clara walked out of the barn. She wiped her hands on a rag. "Mail?" she asked. Silas looked up. He held the envelope out. "It's for you. From the county bank." Clara's stomach turned over. A cold, sharp stone dropped in her gut. The bank didn't send letters by private rider unless it was a threat. She walked over. She took the envelope. Her hands felt clumsy. She tore the edge open and pulled out a single sheet of stiff paper. She read it once, then she read it again. The words swam. Clause 4, subsection B. Modification of assets. Premature liquidation. Your foreclosure date has been adjusted. Payment in full is due in 12 days. 12 days. Not 30. 12. She was $19 short. Silas couldn't pay her $19 for 12 days of work. It mathematically wasn't possible. The paper fluttered in her hand. The wind caught it, making a dry, mocking sound. "Josiah Vance," Silas said. Clara snapped her head up. "What?" "Vance," Silas repeated. His voice was heavy, dark. "He sits on the loan review board for the county bank. He went digging through your husband's original contract. He found a loophole about selling off assets. Because you sold some cattle last spring to make a partial payment, he argued you violated the terms. He pushed the bank to shorten the note." Clara stared at him. The cold stone in her stomach turned into hot, rising panic. And then the panic turned into something sharper. "How do you know that?" Clara asked. Her voice was dangerously quiet. Silas didn't look away. He didn't lie. He was a man who stood by his words, even when they condemned him. "I rode into town last week to buy nails," Silas said. "I heard Arthur Higgins talking about it. Vance was bragging at the Mercantile, said he was going to squeeze you until you had no choice but to come to him." The world seemed to stop spinning. The bright blue sky felt oppressive. "Last week?" Clara's voice shook, not with fear, with a sudden white-hot fury. "You knew about this a week ago?" "Clara, did you know?" she demanded, stepping forward. "Yes," Silas said. "And you didn't tell me." It wasn't a question. It was a physical blow. Silas took a step down from the porch. He held his hands out, a gesture of appeasement. "I didn't tell you because you were already working yourself to the bone. You were exhausted. I didn't want you to carry that panic while swinging a scythe in the hot sun. I was trying to protect you from the stress." "Protect me?" Clara spat the word out like it was poison. "Yes, I have the money, Clara, in my lockbox inside. I was going to offer you the $19 as a loan. You can pay me back next year, the year after. It doesn't matter. The bank won't take your land." He thought this would calm her. He thought the offer of salvation would put out the fire. He was wrong. Clara backed away from him. She looked at him as if she had never seen him before. The intimacy they had built the night of the rainstorm shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces on the dusty ground between them. "My dignity and my autonomy are not things you can purchase with good intentions, Silas," Clara said. Her voice trembled with the sheer force of her conviction. The educational weight of her anger demanded to be heard. Silas looked confused, then defensive. "I'm offering to help you. Vance is trying to ruin you. And you let him play his game in the dark while I thought I was walking in the light," Clara shot back. "Listen to me. When you hid the truth from me, you stripped me of my right to govern my own life. You took away my choice." "I took away the panic," Silas argued. "No," Clara's voice cracked like a whip. "You took away my agency. You decided what I was strong enough to handle. That isn't protection, Silas. That is a blatant, arrogant disregard for a woman's capacity to weather her own storm. You acted just like Vance. You treated me like a child who needed a man to manage the ugly parts of the world for her." Silas froze. The comparison to Josiah Vance hit him harder than a physical punch. "I am not Vance," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, wounded scrape. "Then you should have respected me enough to hand me the truth," Clara said. Tears of pure, absolute frustration burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "A fair chance. That was our bargain. But there is no fairness without honesty." She turned away from him. She walked to the hook on the porch rail where she kept her apron. She untied it from her waist. She folded it. The movements were mechanical, precise. "Clara, don't do this," Silas pleaded. It was the first time she had ever heard him sound desperate. "Don't let your pride cost you your farm." Clara turned back to him. She held her folded apron against her chest. "It's not pride, Silas. It's self-respect," she said softly. "I cannot build a life or save a home on ground where I am not treated as a full, capable human being. Keep your money." She walked past him. She didn't go to the chestnut horse. She went to the old, sway-backed gray mare Silas had let her use for the commute. She saddled the horse in silence. Silas stood in the dirt, watching her. His scarred hand opened and closed at his side, useless. Clara swung up into the saddle. She didn't look back at the house. She didn't look back at the man standing in the yard. She kicked the mare's flanks and rode out of the broken oak, taking the long, muddy road back to a home she was going to lose. The timber house was quiet. Too quiet. Clara sat at her kitchen table. The tin box sat open in front of her. $68. It looked small in the lamplight. 8 days left. She hadn't gone back to the broken oak. She had spent the last 4 days trying to find work in town. She offered to mend. She offered to scrub. She even walked into the mercantile and asked Arthur Higgins if he needed a clerk. Arthur had looked terrified, glancing at the back room where Beatrice was sorting thread. He said no. The town had closed its doors. Josiah Vance had made sure of that. Clara closed the tin box. The metallic snap echoed in the empty room. She was out of options. She was out of time. The next morning, she heard a horse in the yard. She walked to the porch. It wasn't Silas. It was the mail rider. He tipped his hat, handed her a thick, unmarked brown envelope, and rode away without a word. Clara frowned. She tore the thick paper open. There was no letter, No signature, just 2 pages of legal parchment drafted by a law firm in El Paso. The words were dense, legal, but Clara had an educated mind. She read them twice. It was a precedent, a ruling from a district judge 3 counties over. It explicitly stated that modification of assets could not be used to prematurely liquidate a loan if the debtor was making consistent documented payments on the principal. A handwritten note was scribbled in the margin, pencil, familiar jagged handwriting. Take this to the bank. Demand a formal review. The law requires a 30-day stay during any formal review of contract terms. Silas. He hadn't sent her $19. He hadn't paid her debt. He hadn't played the hero coming to rescue the helpless widow. He had handed her a weapon she could wield herself. Clara stared at the parchment. Her chest tightened. A knot she hadn't realized she was carrying suddenly broke loose. He had listened to her. He had heard her anger, her demand for agency, and he had respected it. She didn't waste a second. She saddled the gray mare. She rode into Marfa with her back straight. She tied the mare in front of the bank. She walked through the heavy oak doors. Josiah Vance was sitting at the manager's desk, looking over a ledger. He looked up. He smiled. "Mrs. Pendleton," Vance said smoothly, "have you come to hand over the deed?" Clara walked to the desk. She slapped the legal parchment down on the polished mahogany. "Read it," Clara said. Vance frowned. He picked up the paper. His eyes darted across the text. His face drained of color. "This is a precedent," Clara stated. Her voice was rhythmic, absolute. "I am formally contesting the premature liquidation of my note. Under state banking regulations, that requires a formal review. And a formal review grants an automatic 30-day stay of execution on the original deadline." Vance sputtered. "You can't afford a lawyer to argue this." Clara leaned forward, her hands planted flat on his desk. "The law is not a weapon forged exclusively for the wealthy, Josiah," Clara said, her voice carrying across the quiet bank. "It is a shield for the citizen. I don't need a lawyer to read it for me, and I don't need a man to speak for me. Restore my original 30 days, now, or I will take this to the circuit judge myself." Vance looked at the paper. He looked at Clara's eyes. He saw no bluff. He picked up his pen. He struck a line through the date on her file. He wrote the original date back in. Clara took her papers. She walked out. She had her 30 days. She had her breathing room. She untied the gray mare. But she didn't ride home. She turned the horse northwest. The ride to Broken Oak felt different this time. The air felt lighter. The sun felt warm, not oppressive. When she rode into the yard, Silas was by the corral. He was brushing down the chestnut horse. He stopped when he saw her. He didn't drop the brush. He just waited. Clara dismounted. She walked over to the wooden fence. "I got 30 days, Clara said. Silas nodded slowly. "Good. You went to El Paso?" "I sent a wire to a lawyer I know," Silas said. "Cost $1, money well spent." Clara looked at his scarred hands. She thought about the anger she had hurled at him on the porch. "I was wrong," Clara said. The words were hard to say, but they needed to be said. Silas looked up. "You weren't wrong to be angry, Clara. I hid the truth." "No, I was wrong about what I thought made me strong," Clara said. She stepped closer to the fence. She looked him directly in the eyes. The educational weight of her realization poured out. "My extreme pride was just another form of prejudice, Silas," Clara stated clearly. "I was so afraid of being helpless again that I pushed away the one person who actually saw me. Rejecting genuine companionship didn't make me stronger. It only isolated me." Silas walked to the fence. He rested his good arm on the top rail. "I was a fool to hide Vance's threat from you," Silas said. "I treated you like glass. I won't ever do that again. Compassion between human beings means granting each other permission to step into our places of vulnerability," Clara said, her voice steady and true. "You didn't try to buy my dignity today, Silas. You gave me the tools to defend it myself. Thank you." Silas's slate-gray eyes softened. A genuine, quiet relief washed over his face. "You did the fighting," Silas said. "I still need a job," Clara said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I have $19 to earn." "The late wheat needs cutting," Silas replied. He pushed off the fence. "Coffee?" "Black," Clara said. They walked up to the porch together. The fracture was healed, and the bone was stronger where it had broken. The harvest was finished. It was mid-November. The frost had finally come, turning the prairie grass brittle and white, but the silos at Broken Oak were full. Clara had earned her $87. She had the money in her tin box. She was going to the bank on Monday to pay it off for good. Saturday morning brought a surprise to the ranch. A stagecoach dropped off a passenger at the end of the long drive. A young woman walked up to the house carrying a single leather valise. She had Silas's dark hair, but her eyes were warm and bright. Abigail Montgomery, 26 years old, Silas's daughter. Silas nearly dropped a bucket of oats when he saw her. He wrapped his good arm around her in a fierce hug. Clara watched from the porch. She felt a sudden sharp pang of intrusion. This was his family. She was just the hired help whose contract was essentially over. She wiped her hands and prepared to quietly ride home. But Abigail pulled away from her father, looked at the porch, and smiled. "You must be Clara," Abigail said, walking right up the steps. She didn't offer a polite handshake. She pulled Clara into a brief, warm embrace. My father's letters had been full of nothing but the wheat harvest, the weather, and Mrs. Pendleton. Clara felt her cheeks warm. "It's a pleasure, Abigail. Call me Abby." She dropped her bag. "And please tell me there is coffee." The stagecoach ride from San Antonio was miserable. Later that afternoon, Silas rode out to check the eastern fence line. Clara and Abby were in the kitchen. Clara was peeling potatoes for a stew. Abby was sitting at the table, watching her with a perceptive, knowing gaze. "He looks good," Abby said softly. "My father. He looks alive." "He's a hard worker," Clara said, keeping her eyes on the potato. "He's a lonely man," Abby corrected gently. "Or he was." Clara stopped peeling. She looked at the younger woman. "Abby, I am just a hired hand. My contract is up on Monday. I pay my bank loan, and then I go back to my own farm." Abby smiled, a sad, affectionate smile. "Clara, do you honestly believe it was an accident that you ended up here?" Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "The chestnut horse," Abby said. "Chestnut. He wandered onto my property. It happens." Abby shook her head. "Chestnut is a led horse. He doesn't wander. He stays by the barn, always." Clara put the knife down. The kitchen was very quiet. "2 days before that horse showed up at your place," Abby said, "my father went into town. He heard Arthur Higgins talking. He heard that Josiah Vance was moving against your farm. He heard the bank was going to serve you a foreclosure notice." Clara's breath caught. Silas had known even earlier than she realized. "He came home," Abby continued. "He sat at this table. He wrote me a letter. He said he knew a good woman who was about to lose everything, but she was too fiercely proud to accept a handout. He said if he rode over and offered money, you would slam the door in his face." Clara stared at her hands. Abby was right. She would have. "So," Abby said softly, "he didn't ride over. He went out to the corral before dawn. He took Chestnut, and he opened the eastern gate, the gate that leads straight across the scrub toward the Pendleton farm. He left it wide open. He knew the horse would follow the sweetgrass right to your well." The truth hit Clara like a physical weight. It wasn't fate. It wasn't an accident. "He gave you a reason to come here," Abby said. "A dignified reason. He orchestrated a scenario where you were doing him a favor by returning his property, just so he could get you onto his porch and invite you for coffee. Just so he could offer you a job without hurting your pride." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She didn't try to stop them this time. The profound, breathtaking respect of that action overwhelmed her. A man of the West, a rough, scarred rancher. He had understood her need for dignity so deeply that he had staged a runaway horse just to give her a chance to save herself. "He didn't want to save you, Clara," Abby whispered. "He just wanted to leave a gate open for you." That evening, when Silas returned, Clara was waiting on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges. The air was biting cold. Clara had 2 tin cups of black coffee resting on the wooden crate. Silas walked up the steps. He looked tired. He looked at the coffee. Clara didn't sit in the chair opposite him. She pulled her chair around the crate. She sat right beside him, facing the same direction. Equals. Silas sat down slowly. He picked up his cup. "Abby told me about the gate," Clara said. Silas froze. His cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He stared straight ahead at the darkening fields. He didn't deny it. "You didn't force your way into my life," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out. She placed her hand over his scarred right hand. "You didn't demand I accept your help. You respected my autonomy. You left a gate open, and you gave me the choice to walk through it." Silas turned his head. His eyes met hers. "True partnership," Clara stated, her voice clear and resonant in the cold air, "isn't about one person rescuing the other. It is about creating a space where both people can stand tall. You gave me that space, Silas." Silas turned his hand over. He laced his stiff, scarred fingers through hers. "I'd leave every gate in Texas open if it brought you to this porch, Clara," Silas said. They sat together in the cold, but their hands were warm, and the coffee was perfect. Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Clara Pendleton walked into the Marfa County Bank. She wore her best blue dress. It was mended at the hem, but it was clean, and it was pressed. Josiah Vance was sitting at his desk. He looked up. Clara didn't say a word. She walked to the desk. She opened her tin box. She took out a stack of silver dollars and worn paper notes. She counted them out, one by one, onto the polished mahogany. $87. "Count it, Josiah," Clara said. Vance looked at the money. His jaw clenched. He counted it. He opened his ledger, took his pen, and wrote the words across her file. "Paid in full." Clara took the receipt. She folded it. She put it in her pocket. She walked out of the bank. The air smelled like winter, sharp and clean. Silas was waiting across the street, holding the reins of the gray mare and the chestnut. He saw her face. He didn't ask. He just tipped his hat. 3 months later. It was February of 1879. The ground was frozen solid. The wind howled off the plains. Inside the small timber church in Marfa, it was warm. The wood stove glowed red in the corner. There were no grand floral arrangements, no silk gowns, just the people who mattered. Mateo was there, walking with a slight limp, but smiling. Abby had come back from San Antonio. Even Arthur Higgins slipped in the back, leaving Beatrice complaining at the mercantile. Clara stood at the front. She wore a dark navy dress. Silas stood beside her. He wore a clean black suit. He looked handsome. He looked nervous. The preacher, an old man with a booming voice, asked for the vows. They hadn't rehearsed the standard words. Silas turned to Clara. He took both of her hands in his. "Clara," Silas said. His voice echoed in the quiet church. He didn't stumble. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "I swear to always stand beside you as an equal partner," Silas vowed. The educational truth of his promise resonated off the wooden pews. "I will never step ahead to overshadow your talents, nor will I linger behind when you need support. A marriage is not ownership. It is a shared yoke. I promise to respect your mind, to honor your calling, and to always brew the morning coffee so we have the time to listen to each other's souls." Tears blurred Clara's vision, but she didn't wipe them away. She looked at the man who had given her a fair chance when the world had given her none. "And I promise," Clara replied, her voice steady and rhythmic, "to never let pride build a wall between us. I promise to use my hands to heal, to build, and to hold yours when the winter is long. We will face the storms as two whole people walking the same road. The preacher smiled. I pronounce you husband and wife. Silas leaned in. He kissed her. It wasn't a desperate kiss. It was a promise. Solid, deep, real. Spring, 1880. The prairie was green. The bluebonnets were blooming, painting the Texas scrub in vibrant, defiant color. The Broken Oak Ranch had changed. The Pendleton land had been joined with it. But that wasn't the biggest change. Attached to the side of the main house was a new room. It had large glass windows. Inside there were clean white cots, a cabinet full of glass bottles, bandages, and carbolic acid. A wooden sign hung above the door, painted in neat black letters. Clara Montgomery, Medical Care. It was an informal clinic, free of charge for those who couldn't pay, barter for those who could. Women from town, the same women who had whispered about her, now drove their buggies out to the ranch when their children ran a fever. Cowboys with rope burns and broken fingers rode in to get stitched up properly. Clara had reclaimed her calling. She wasn't just surviving, she was living. It was early morning. The sun was just breaking the horizon, spilling gold across the green wheat. Clara sat on the front porch. She wore a crisp white apron over her dress. She had a medical journal open on her lap, reading up on a new method for treating cattle fever. The screen door creaked. Silas stepped out. The scar on his arm was still there, but his grip was stronger. He held 2 tin cups. Steam curled up into the cool morning air. He walked over. He set 1 cup on the wooden crate next to her. He sat down in the chair beside her. They didn't speak. They watched the sun come up. Clara reached out. She picked up the tin cup. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. The coffee was dark, earthy, perfect. She didn't look up from her medical journal. She just smiled, a quiet, contented curve of her lips. "You brewed it right this time," Clara said. Silas leaned back in his chair. He looked at the woman beside him. He looked at the land they worked together. "I had a good teacher," Silas said. He took a sip of his coffee. The Texas wind blew across the porch, but neither of them felt the cold. The gate was open, and they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
This story reminds us that real empowerment comes from within, from believing in your worth and refusing to let others decide your fate. It also teaches that strength and compassion can exist side by side. Our channel brings you stories of the Western frontier, love, sacrifice, motherhood, and the beauty of human connection. If this story inspired you, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to support more stories that matter. As the dust settles over the wide Texas prairie and the last echoes of Clara Pendleton's footsteps fade into the wind, what remains is not just the story of a woman who fought to save her home, but the story of a human spirit that refused to be diminished. This tale reminds us that dignity is not something granted by society, nor protected by wealth or status. It is something forged quietly, in the hardest moments when no one is watching. When a person chooses integrity over ease, courage over fear, and self-respect over surrender. Clara did not ask to be saved, and that is precisely what made her strong. She demanded the right to stand on her own, to earn her place in the world, and to face her struggles with clear eyes and steady hands. But this story is not only about independence, it is also about understanding the balance between strength and connection. Through Silas, we see that respect is not control, and care is not ownership. True compassion lies in recognizing another person's autonomy, in standing beside them rather than in front of them, and in offering support without taking away their voice. Their journey shows us that trust is not built through protection alone, but through honesty, equality, and the willingness to see each other as whole human beings. There is also a deeper lesson here about the quiet injustices that shape our world, the assumptions placed on women, the expectations forced upon men, and the invisible walls that keep people from becoming who they truly are. Clara's lost medical career, Silas's buried grief, and the town's narrow judgment all reflect a society that limits human potential. Yet in their defiance, we are reminded that those limits are not absolute. They can be challenged. They can be broken. In the end, this story teaches us that survival is not enough. To truly live, we must claim our worth, honor our abilities, and extend to others the same dignity we demand for ourselves. It is about choosing fairness over prejudice, courage over silence, and humanity over convenience. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that even in the harshest landscapes, whether they are made of dust or circumstance, hope can take root, grow, and endure. So as you walk away from this story, carry with you this simple truth. Your value is not defined by what the world takes from you, but by what you refuse to give up. Your integrity, your voice, and your right to stand as your own person.